kind of glad James went first, because you set the tone, so I can now say some things that are possibly a bit less profound, but nonetheless, I hope, interesting to add to discussion. I think David asked me to do this, possibly for two reasons. One is that I've sort of fellow-travelled with this research from the very beginning and have seen it in all its various twists and turns, you know, can add to the very positive comments I think James just made about, I think, the very, you know, it's not only an impressive piece of work, but it's the incredible diligence with which the team of Fred, David, Richard, Vicky and others really applied to this work. And the real desire to move beyond just another set of really interesting stories about governance in Africa to something that really breaks through some of that glass ceiling that I think tends to exist in this field about how to think and do these things differently. And I think this piece of work is a culmination of a fantastic effort on all of your parts. But I think the second reason was that as an economist by training, I have a slightly different slant on some of the issues that are raised in the report, and therefore I hope that I'll be able to add a little bit to the depth of discussion. You know, the merit of a really good piece of work is the scribble factor, and I don't know if you can see, but that's the front page of the document I was reading over the weekend, and it indeed has a very high scribble factor. And, you know, there are many, many, many things that I absolutely fundamentally agree with in this piece of work, including many of the conclusions and where you come out. But ODI is a creative, challenging intellectual community, and so in that spirit I will add a few areas where I may be a little less convinced perhaps, or at least want more from the work to convince me that the steps taken really add up to exactly where the report comes out. So the first is, for those of us who've had a chance to read the full report, it didn't really come out so much in the presentation. There's a kind of opening backdrop to this work, which is pretty much, if I paraphrase, you know, Africa may be working now, but it's only working at a superficial level, and it really isn't undergoing the kind of transformation, structural change, that is really needed to take it forward developmentally. So the headlines about growth, about Africa rising, about African lions and African cheetahs, yes, fine, but actually, you know, there's another story behind all this, and let's not get carried away. And actually, the promise of transformation is still not realised across most of the continent. Well, as a broad headline, I don't disagree with that, but I actually think the report seriously underplays things that are actually changing and moving in a positive direction on the continent, particularly in the economic space. It pays a little bit too much attention to the line that, well, Africa is only growing today because of China. Well, I think there's a growing amount of evidence to suggest that a number of African economies are growing not only because of China and the whole commodity boom, but because of quite deep structural changes going on within their own societies, increasing domestic consumption, for example, the rise of a burgeoning African middle class, demographic dividends that are essentially yielding a very newly educated young workforce across many parts of the continent that is beginning to drive a new spirit of entrepreneurialism. These changes are taking place. They are not all hinged on the rise of emerging market economies. And I think, is that, you know, critical to the debate? Well, not really, but I think it should be acknowledged that, you know, more progress is probably being made than is given credit here. And some of the transformation gaps that then are brought up in the rest of the report are, well, I think perhaps not as enormous, or at least not as untouched as the rest of the report implies. So my first point is, stories of African success, are they overdone? Well, yes, of course, we need to make sure the pendulum doesn't swing too far, but transformation is taking place, not entirely in conventional places, not according to the structure, to the textbooks of 20, 30 years ago, but certainly structural change is taking place. That's my first point. The second point is that a core proposition of the work is that the development industry as a whole has relied way too much on, if you like, these imported models or these best fit solutions. particularly in the governance space, or arguably in many aspects of the development industry, and that these, as it were, imported models for good governance have delivered superficial change at best and actually been part of the problem at worst. And I think that's actually hard to disagree with as an opening proposition. And it reminds me of the adage that, you know, if the model doesn't fit reality, then change reality. Well, this report makes a very, very strong claim for start looking at reality and think very hard about your model. And I think it does that probably better than anything I've seen for quite a long time. But this notion of the lack of fit, if you like, or the irrelevance, or at worst, and maybe the superficiality of some of these imported models, does rest on this critique of principal-agent thinking. Principal-agent thinking comes from theory of the firm originally, and kind of got brought into the political economy world, largely through looking at the relationship between political principles political principles and voter agents. And I think, actually, yes, there are many limitations to principal-agent thinking, but I'm not as convinced that one needs to completely shred it in order to make the argument that actually thinking about collective action is the way forward. And in fact, Åström's work, I think, offers quite a nice blending of principal-agent thinking and thinking about collective action problems. And that work, particularly the work on the political economy of development aid, argues very strongly that what we need to think about is actually multiple principles and multiple agents who have different sorts of interests that need to be aligned. And actually there is therefore no one solution to that interest alignment, but actually there need to be all kinds of different kinds of solutions that fit local context. And I think, in a way, while the straitjacket of principal-agent thinking that you refer to is correct, it's because it's an extremely simplified and oversimplified and somewhat caricatured version of principal-agent thinking. If we think about the principal-agent problem as one of interest alignment, you don't need to assume that the principal is a selfless, developmentally orientated individual. They, in fact, can have a set of interests that are very much to do with self, but it is about trying to find mechanisms for aligning those interests with a variety of different agents. So my point there is simply, I don't entirely feel that you need to sort of knock that quite so squarely on the head in order to get you to the place of arguing much more for a sort of collective action framing of challenges and so forth. What I do agree with very much in the report is the challenge that it poses to what I call the fetishization of incentives. I mean, the number of discussions in this field that end up, it's all about incentives, without really much further thought about, well, you know, what does that look like in practice? How are those expressed locally, and how do they relate to the specific problems of delivering public goods and merit goods? I think is very sloppy thinking and tends to very much pervade the kind of best fit, good practice thinking that David and his team are so critical of. But the core point of this work is that really the lack of the sort of structural change and transformation that the team are looking for in many African countries is really a failure of collective action, and a failure of collective action in the public goods and merit goods space. And again, for any of us who've worked for any length of time in African societies, I think you recognise that problem. You know, these goods are underprovided, and they are chronically underprovided, despite many, many efforts to deliver them more systematically to broader groups of people. The way to sort of resolve the challenge of underprovision, according to the APPP, is to kind of break out of the box of this restrictive thinking about incentives and this notion of imported models, but to work much more with the grain, to to focus much more on setting a context within which problem solving can take place at all kinds of levels of government and non-government, and to essentially release the energies and creativity of different kinds of actors to solve public goods problems. Now, this to me makes enormous sense, but there are a few questions I still have in my mind about how one achieves that. And I'm just going to raise a few, and then just raise a couple of questions about the way forward. There's a strong argument throughout the report about what I call the tight-loose paradigm of this work, which is the need for very strong centralised management of rents under enlightened leadership, combined with this much freer context at local level to solve certain collective action problems. And I call that the sort of tight-loose strategy here. It reminds me of management theory a little bit. Now, I can absolutely see that a number of the empirical cases used in the report point to that scenario, but I can't quite see how they relate together. How does centralised rent management work with a strategy of more local problem solving? What is the mechanism for making that happen? The Rwanda case is an interesting one, but it's only one case where you might be able to say we can see that in motion. And the Rwanda case very much hinges around the health sector and particularly improvement in maternal health outcomes. But I don't really see any particular elaboration of what the mechanism is to allow for this very sort of clear central, and you call them vertical disciplines, performance disciplines flowing from the top, combined with this, as it were, freedom at local level to solve certain collective action problems. And I'd like to know more about those things. The other thing is that the whole strategy depends on this notion of enlightened leadership at the centre. Absolutely, I buy that. How do we get that? And clearly it's one in which the idea of the need for centralised rents as a way to overcome this problem of sort of non-developmental coalitions, if you like, that tend to acquire rents at local levels and so forth. If that really hinges on the need for enlightened leadership with a long-term vision, then great, but I really don't entirely know what we do about that, and maybe we can do nothing about that as an external community. The other area that I'm slightly confused about is really the kind of enabling environment at local level for local problem solving. One is about the mechanism that links centralised rent management with local problem solving. The other is, what does an enabling environment at local level look like for local problem solving? There's a lack of detail there. I don't know necessarily that I know what that would look like if I ran into it. And I think there is my desire in the report was to get more information about that and more sense of, would we know one if we saw it? And if so, what would be the features of this enabling environment? There's quite a strong criticism in the report of kind of imposed solutions in terms of voluntary organisations at local levels doing good things for communities. But there is a strong appeal to build on associational life at local level where it's good at resolving collective action problems. Again, this sounds right to me in many respects, but I'm not entirely sure we know the difference, or don't have enough information in the report about knowing the difference between what is strong associational life that's good at solving collective action problems and what are, efforts to superimpose on local organisations that actually miss the point, that don't actually generate the right kinds of solutions for communities and so forth. Again, I'm not entirely sure we had enough detail on that. And so my final point is really about the role of the external community. And I think actually, the report hits so many of the right buttons here, and is quite a fundamental challenge really to the way in which we think about the role for external actors in the governance space, if you like, in not only African countries but many low-income countries around the world. And I think the point about needing to think about development as a collective action problem or a series of collective action problems is very helpful. I think the messaging around that is complicated. I can't quite imagine what the brief to Justin Greening would be on that, but nevertheless, I think we've got to try. I think this is not something that we can simply skirt around and think is too difficult. I think this is exactly where we need to be now applying a lot of our efforts and thinking about how do we communicate this in a way that really makes a difference to the bigger narrative about the role of external assistance in supporting economic and political transformation. And the last thing is about arm's length engagement. I really like this idea, and I think there are potentially really positive examples of where the donor community has separated the funding from the engagement, if you like, and as a result has got a much better take-up on the engagement, the advice, the technical support than if the money was flowing behind it. So, and actually very early budget support arrangements were an attempt to separate some of the money from some of the discussions around, what to do and what to do better. We're not in an environment, it seems to me at the moment, where that would actually play particularly well. But I do think there is something about creating these kind of independent bodies that can provide high quality embedded technical advice that is highly context specific, while the money that is still actually important actually flows through a different route. And I do think that is actually a very interesting challenge. Again, what the message would be around that, particularly in the current climate, I think is, that's where the challenge lies.